big question how, culture thinks about sexual abuse, sexual assault, particularly for Pacific, given that, really important to understand the culture before you understand the impact and the, how they think about sexual abuse, sexual assault, don't you think, Sarah?
Yeah. I suppose in terms from our good practice guidelines, which yourself and there was a group of 10 others that were involved, counsellors, psychotherapists, family therapists. We just stated there, like in terms of for Pacific, we have Indigenous values like Whāwhirawai, and that sacred space that we have between ourselves and others. So when sexual violation occurs, when sexual occurs, that is a violation that has taken place, and for most Pacific families, it could be that it's shrouded in secrecy and silence.
Totally.
However, what we had discussed, it's starting to come out now, which is important for our community.
Yeah. And that space is so important, isn't it? So someone who is sexually assaulted, sexually violated, that space is shattered, isn't it? It's just really destructive and a really important part of their being, which I think is really important when we think about Pacific people.
And the impact on their being would be spiritually, physically, emotionally, even their spirit and their soul. And I suppose for us as Pacific, our heart, in it all. So it's major, it's huge.
And I think, Pacific people have such a strong sense of identity, don't they? A strong sense of family, of God, spirituality, which makes up that var, that space, doesn't it, the var? And when that's shattered, it's like there's something deep that happens, don't you think? It's just hard to put words to it because it's like their whole being is disconnected. There's a huge disconnection with God, with family, and to exist in that space is really difficult, and so making sense of that's really important, and understanding that's really important.
I suppose the impact on of sexual violence, both in terms of how they think about themselves and also what others face, I suppose, and what other people think about them too. The impact is huge. How most Pacific Island survivors think about themselves. So from our findings, there were thoughts of shame, deep sense of shame, almost like a cloak of shame. I can recall the heaviness of that. Self-blame, guilt, anger, low self-esteem, even suicidal thoughts, which often led out to acting out behaviours. So the acting out behaviours were, I suppose, engaging in drug and alcohol, and that's to self-soothe or self-medicate their pain. What they felt, which included, could be friends, family, community, church community, is the stigma of it's your fault.
Yeah, very much.
The sexual abuse is minimised or silenced in order to maintain just our cultural Indigenous values of respect, solidarity, and unity in the community. However, in saying this, when we talked about it in our findings, there were people that were prepared to stand with them when they did start to open up, when they did start to tell their story. So whether it be a friend, whether it been a cousin, whether it been a school counsellor, or even someone in the community, or even a church youth leader, or someone in church that they trusted. So that's how I sort of saw.
It is, and that importance of finding someone in the family, and it's like you were saying before, the secrecy is reinforced by the fact that a lot of times in culture, when you're growing up in a Pacific family, you're not encouraged to speak about your feelings, you're not encouraged to even, you know, in the presence of adults or in family, you're there, seen but not heard. You know, so then when something happens, you are even shut down even more in terms of sexual assault, sexual abuse. So you don't come forward with that. So finding that someone who believes you, who you can talk to, who, you know, just is able to bridge that space for that, you know, just in that time is really important. And, you know, even before you even tell families, I think, you know, in terms of, you know, what other people think, you know, the family's so important. But, you know, because of that shame, you don't want to tell your family. Your family's the last people you want to tell, and yet the people you really need to tell because it's that connection. So finding that someone that, you know, believes in you, that can support you in that space is important for you to, take the next step.
And it takes courage
Yeah.
to tell, particularly when you know you've been sitting in silence for so long and thinking that you're alone and no one else knows. A point of just being down, but also, you know, as Pacific survivors and Pacific people, we're quite proud people. Families are really crucial, like they're important. That's almost like that's our lives, you know. And so to tell on someone is huge. And they could be in positions of authority, you know, so therefore if they're younger, they sort of don't want to do that out of respect, you know, and to keep the unity is important, you know, and not wanting to break up the family unit or the extended family. So therefore it's important for them to know that, you know, that just approach one person, you know, just open their hearts up.
Totally.
It's important.
Yeah. And then also in terms of like their parents, I mean, often, you know, your mothers or your aunts have their own stories. So, you know, going to them, it's like you were saying before, you know, well, it was, you know, you're blamed, you know, it's your fault, you know, what were you doing, or it's minimised somehow. So, so a young person is going to think twice before telling their parents or making sure they've got that support to be able to, you know, tell their parents, which actually adds weight to, you know, being believed.
And that's young in terms of young people. There's even mature women and men that have carried those stories for years and have not told. But from our findings, we believe it's time that it's okay to start to open up. It's okay to talk and tell. Part of the healing process, you know. And, healing for ourselves.
What do you think would help them, you know, come forward, the older generations? Because like you're saying, I mean, gosh, you know, it does take a lot of courage to come forward. And just thinking for, you know, the older ladies who do carry a lot, what would it take for them? Yeah, and I think too in the findings, you know, how we were saying that engaging in the Pacific community, engaging with people, so the more it's talked about, the more that people will feel safe to come forward or talk about it even more, you know, or even within their families, you know, be able to talk and come forward.
Yeah, I suppose that question of what's important in our culture that sort of brings that safety and healing, you know.
Yeah.
And, you know, from our discussions and the guidelines, you know, Indigenous values are critical in the healing process for a Pacific survivor who experienced sexual violence. So we did cover that aspect of vāwheluai, which is a Samoan term, space between two persons, you know. Being able to use that, it's invaluable, and being able to, I suppose, build an effective relationship, you know, just a rapport is important, yeah. Because when a Pacific survivor of sexual abuse does disclose, even more so because that's a sacred space we're dealing with now, yeah. So in that sacred space that we're talking about, that's when the conversations start to happen. So in those conversations, whether it's a crisis support worker that is with the Pacific survivor, it's being able to hold that space and being respectful, you know, of what they bring in the rooms. It's almost like being client-centered, or in that sort of, in that respectfulness of too, you know.
Yeah. And I think you're right. So for a crisis response person, it's important to understand that actually the process takes time. So sometimes just being is important, you know. So not kind of launching into, you know, what's happened, these are the options and all of that sort of stuff. So sometimes just being with that person, because it is about relationship, it is about building that relationship to be able to step into that space with that person. So I think what's important there is too that it's the same person. So having someone who's perhaps supporting in an acute situation then is able to follow up and follow through. So having that same person, so you're building that rapport, so that you're journeying with that person, I think is important. So, you know, to the stage where then they're supported to be able to then, you know, tell the family and sort of, you know, so that when they're ready to tell the family, then, you know, you're journeying with them in that. So, yeah, that, you know, I think that's really important.
Yeah. What's also important too is the, I suppose, the conversations around safety. So particularly when they've presented. So that comes back to identifying key people, you know, one person within their community of care, within their village, or whether it be a family member, whether it be someone in community, whether it be someone in church that they call on, you know, just to be there in terms of support. But also too, it's an alliance, someone to support them, particularly if sexual abuse or sexual assault has occurred within communities.
Yeah, and that is important, isn't it? Particularly the church. I mean, you know, that is important to the Pacific people, the spirituality, the, you know, connection, Christian values, really, really important. And yet, it could be that it's been the church that's done the abuse, you know, the minister or a youth worker, or, you know, often we have cases where it is the youth worker or it is the, you know, someone who's an authority that, you know, has sexually abused or so again, being aware that having a support person has to be the right person, but also keeping in mind that although it's been the church that's abused in terms of someone that's, you know, represents the church, that it's still important. It really is still important to, you know, to the family, to the healing, to that journey. So yeah, and it is working with the family, isn't it? I mean, when you're working with a survivor of sexual abuse, you are absolutely working with them, but you do have to work with the family as well. And what I find is interesting as well, though, is that with the concept of family, because it's so important, that privacy and confidentiality is a family thing, you know? So it's like what happens in the family stays in the family and is all about the family, because, you know, for Pacific people, it's more about, you know, the family and connectedness rather than individualism. So, you know, although, yes, confidentiality and privacy is important to the individual, for a Pacific family, it's actually the family where confidentiality is sort of, you know, is important and not so much accepted but allowed, really.
And I suppose that's that they need to have in that space, you know, around confidentiality and around the values, you know, Indigenous values is the importance of family. Even the explanation of confidentiality means, you know, what does that mean? What does that look like? And what is the exception to that, you know, in terms of safety? That's so important, and particularly with Pacific survivors where English is their second language. Sort of think about them when, you know, all these words, but, you know, plus the trauma can be overwhelming. So for crisis support workers, just, I suppose, would be just accessing cultural support or advice, checking in with the Pacific survivor. Look, you know, is there anyone, like they may identify already one person in their village or in their community of care that can come. But also to checking in, you know, they may need a cultural support, and I think that's important. We're going to have that cultural responsiveness. It's so important.
Yeah, you know, accessing a cultural supervisor for sure, and also, you know, increasing that cultural competency and awareness. I think is really important as well. You know, bringing cases, you know, that include, you know, Pacific survivors, and being able to, you know, take those to, cultural supervision, so that, you know, we're all learning, really, aren't we?
Yes, yeah. And if we don't know, ask.
Yeah.
It's okay to ask. You know, just in consult, and ask, which is really important. Because in dealing with Pacific survivor, you know, for some, you know, workers, it can be quite complex. It may seem overwhelming, particularly if you're a crisis support worker, you're just used to dealing with one individual. However, when a Pacific survivor in the room, they don't come alone. Like, they come from a family, they come from a community, they come from a network of people. So it's just holding that awareness. That's part of holding that space of them. It's really important. And I suppose it comes down to an awareness around the values.
Yeah, totally. But even in that, there's differences too, isn't there? You know, with New Zealand born, with Island born. But even then, even with New Zealand or Island born, there's even, you know, other kind of, I'm thinking other different, you know, more cultures that are included, because so many are, you know, half Samoan, quarter Samoan, or whatever. But that sense of family and those values are still ingrained. It's amazing. It's like the, you know, the embodiment of all of your experiences, but all of the experiences of past generations kind of, you know, play out in terms of, you know, how you view things and how you express things, and your sense of culture.
Yeah. And I think that was the conversation in the guidelines, and was to assess, not assume.
Yes. Yeah, totally.
So in terms of like Pacific, there's Pan-Pacific, there's New Zealand born, Island born. So as they come into the room, checking in. It's really important. So as a crisis support worker, I mean, it'd be great cultural kind of assessment that goes in line, you know, in terms of their reporting, but also access to a consultant if need be, which is really important. So that's key. And then from there, you'll be able to see what are their values. You know, they'll tell you, they'll let you know.
Yeah, that's right. And where they sit with those values as well.
Yeah, where they sit with those values. You know, forms of resilience too.
Gosh, yeah. That'll, regardless of what they've been through, you know, they do carry a lot, but man, you know, they're still a force to be reckoned with. And you know, and it is that courage that brings them forward, isn't it? You know, it is that courage that wants to change things for their people, for their family. Incredibly resilient. Yeah.
And you mentioned early on of churches, you know, from the guidelines I talked about sexual abuse that occurs in church, and in terms of resilience, a Pacific survivor resilience, there is the personal spirituality.
Yeah.
There's still that personal faith in God, and yep, if it's still there, like in terms of particularly trauma, there've been many times when we've asked, you know, what has brought you through, what's gotten you through, you know, like, have you been able to survive? And these stories include their personal faith in God, which is so. I suppose as a crisis support worker, just having that, just being aware that that's there, you know, that is their own personal that they're still holding on to, even in the midst of trauma that they're experiencing.
And that's interesting, isn't it? You know, so the key things for a specific person in terms of, you know, church and their faith in God and family can sometimes be the 2 points that actually the abuse comes from within the church or within the family, in terms of an uncle or, you know, a cousin, or you know, so it's within the family, which is really important to them. You know, both things really, really important, and yet that's also the source of their pain.
And that's where
Yeah.
you know, the values of church or the value of family. So it's being able to hold that, you know, and particularly initially as a crisis support worker, with the acute, you're dealing with safety, you know, and just holding them until such time that they would be probably referred on, you know. And I think it's important for crisis support workers to be honest. Honesty is the best policy, you know, in terms of being able to say, hey, look, because there are, so for example, a Pacific survivor walks into the room, they're disclosing or that sexual abuse or trauma has happened. It's within their community that map out, you know, options, you know, for them, be able to supply them with knowledge that there is that option of, one, you know, do you desire to take it legally? I'll come back to that. Or two, you know, if not, if you decide not to, then this is your pathway to healing. You can be referred to ACC counselling support. You can identify key people in your support services. The issue in terms of legally, that's a pathway that evidence is required. And, you know, for young people, evidential video units, you know, What are your thoughts about that? So,
Well, you're right, it is, but I think that, you know, at the same time we've got to hold that, you know, that survivor is thinking about the options, thinking about the information that they're provided with, absolutely, but also, you know, they also hold the impact that that's going to have on their family, on their church, on their community, and sometimes that's what, you know, may prevent them from taking the path that they want to take, you know, so it is a journey, you know, it may not happen right then, but it can be a process, you know, and it doesn't have to happen right then. It can, you know, it can absolutely take its time. And I think, you know, what is important for Pacific people is that it is a process and it will take time. And it, you know, takes time for the survivor to navigate all those values that are really important to them, all those, you know, to decide on what they want to do.
Yeah.
And that's important.
And having that options and yet, in terms of Pacific survivors, from the guidelines, there was talk about
What's that?
process. Ifunga, in terms of Indigenous healing processes, you know.
Right, yeah.
So ifunga is a Samoan word in terms of healing, restoring back, balance back.
Yeah.
So it would be the representative from the offender of that family, representative from the survivor, and then they come together and address those issues. And that's been an Indigenous way of being able to deal with sexual abuse, and it's known, you know, and so the families know that this has occurred. It's out in the light, so to speak. So
it's been huge in the culture, though, hasn't it? You know. So Sarah, that for me goes back to, and obviously I only know this from my parents, from back in the village in the day when there was, you know, a crime that was done against somebody, the whole family of the offender's family, including, you know, members of the village, community, matai, whatever, would go to the victim's house, and they would remain outside that house until the victim was ready to receive them, was ready to kind of forgive them. And it sometimes took days, my understanding is. So, you know, that process of forgiveness and that process of healing, part of that healing journey is really, really important, that whole kind of restoration process. So I guess for, you know, a survivor of sexual abuse, sexual assault, that's still important, but how that plays out might be different for individuals. And I can imagine, and I, you know, have worked with people who absolutely did not want to forgive, who absolutely just did not want to bar if it were really angry. But in the end, and it was a process of time where they did come around, and you know, and I think it is that value again, isn't it? The value of their, you know, Christian belief, their spirituality, the value of family, the relationship, you know, just restoring that lavar is really important.
and it is a process. And so in the guidelines, there was discussion around that whole process of ifunga. And there was one practitioner, I think, that talked about using that in her practice, you know, as part of the healing, because the client did not want to take it further. They just wanted to sort of address it within the family, within that church community.
Right. And that's the norm, isn't it? You know, that is the norm, to keep it within the community, to work it out in the family.
So it's quite interesting that it's like these Indigenous values being redeemed or restored back, you know, because I suppose the Western ways of dealing with it isn't happening, you know. Most cases, or the police are, you know, not taken further, you know. So it's quite traumatizing for our family to go through that legal process, and only to find that, you know, that doesn't, it's not going to go. And yet, you know, safety-wise initially, long-term wise, in terms of healing and restoration and restoring balance back to the person, to the family, to the church or community, that you know, is distance. So it's quite interesting that, you know, just in the findings there was talk about that, you know, if we bring that back, you know, in terms of within our churches, within our communities. And there are some churches that are trying to do that, being able to address that issue sooner, you know, rather keeping it hidden. Also, Project Restore.
Yes, definitely.
When I think about Project Restore, I think, wow, there's potential, you know, to write for a worker to have not only just a Pacific survivor, but Project Restore could be right there,
Yeah.
you know, in
Yeah.
terms of the engagement of the one other whom they identify.
Yeah.
You know, start.
Yeah. And it's definitely the Pacific way of doing things.
Yeah.
It definitely is.
And forgiveness, that's always a hot topic. I don't know how many over the years, and that's a soft option, Sarah, you know, but for a Pacific survivor, for the ones, there are, I must say some of them, those Pacific survivors, is own personal healing journey, forgiveness had to happen, forgiving themselves and forgiving that offender. And that offender could have been passed away, could be some old person that's passed away, but they come to a full circle. They've tried everything else. So for a Pacific survivor, it's about them, you know, it's about their healing journey, being free, released from shame and guilt and anger, self-blame, you know. That's been powerful in terms of another Indigenous tool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, I think for me, in terms of, you know, I'm thinking of often when, you know, you have someone who has been sexually abused, sexually assaulted, and if they then have the courage to tell their mum or, you know, an aunt or someone, and then it's the mum who doesn't believe them, you know, who just kind of minimises it, or and I'm wondering if that's about, and who blames the victim, you know, she shouldn't have, she's making it up, or she's fantasising, or whatever it is, and I'm wondering if that's their way of not being able to deal with it, you know, not really kind of having a process, or not, you know, I'm just thinking that, you know, in terms of Pacific women, anything that's intimate, they just don't talk about, you know, it's just not something in terms of in the family that you do talk about. So when anything like that is brought up, it is immediately shut down, and it is like kind of, you don't talk about that, you don't know what you're talking about, you know, type thing. And I'm wondering if that's, you know, that then turns into victim blaming because there's no other way to handle it. I don't know, I just, you know, because it happens. And I don't know that there's actually a reason for it, except that it's a cultural thing.
I can recall from the was the importance of education, was the importance of, I suppose, that for our families, you know, of the impact that sexual violence have. Education for our churches, education for our communities. I suppose in terms of the Pacific survivor, you know, when you think about them being alone and carrying that weight for so long, being able to have the courage to tell, coming out, and yet the response might be to let's maintain respect, solidarity, you know, don't, you know, okay, there's that initial kind of response to keep the peace, so to speak.
That's right. And it's almost like those values of family are more important than actually what someone's been through. I'm thinking, you know, of another case where, you know, someone was sexually abused and had told her aunt, who was the matriarch of the family, so you know, the oldest sister was the most important person in the family, and so the aunt wanted to shut it down, keep it within the family. Another aunt wanted to not do that, so it was splitting the family. So of course the survivor then sits with this, you know, I want this, but it's going to split the family, so that's on her as well. And none of it, the family were actually kind of worried about her and what she wanted and what she was going through. It was more about the family, you know, about kind of what's this going to do to the family? This is going to split the family, and the family's really important. So the survivor does tend to get lost in that. in that value.
And that value. And that's where the important, in terms of the crisis support worker, I suppose that being aware of the family systems, being aware of the impact that it's having on them, the challenge is how do you facilitate that process?
And really strong. That family thing is really
strong.
you know,
Because from, if she's identified the auntie, that initial auntie, that's the one you work with. That's the person that you work with, you bring into the room, being able to talk to them, show them the impacts of sexual violence. This is the reason why you know your niece or nephew is acting out. Therefore, this is what support looks like.
That's right.
That's important at that point. And I suppose so if she's a matriarch of the family, to be looking at the wider family too, the impact that it'll have, ripple effects. So the ripple effects too, I think it all comes back to just how to facilitate, because it's the sacred space has been violated, you know?
Yeah, that's right. But you're right, it's going back again to the, you know, the practice guidelines and what we were saying about the importance of education, the importance of working with the church, the importance of interacting with Pacific communities, so that, you know, that education is out there, those, you know, so they have the knowledge to actually think about different ways of still kind of holding the family, but actually, you know, holding what's happened as well as really important too.
And to adding on to that is being able to challenge mindsets. You know, being able to challenge beliefs and values, shift. You know, that can be really uncomfortable, painful. However, in terms of healing process, you know, needs to happen. People need to change. People need to shift. People need to have a, you know, read up as to and effects, but also to look at, you know, holistic ways of how to contribute, you know, to a survivor's healing process.
Yeah, and I think it is changing, you know, I mean, I absolutely do, but at the same time, I think, you know, we're against generations and generations, aren't we, in terms of, but interesting though, like with the good practice guidelines, it was saying that 62% of the Pacific people are now New Zealand born, so that's, you know, that's, I think, what's changing that tide as well, that there are other thoughts of thinking, there are other, you know, ways of being as well, but still holding those values. So hopefully, you know, it will change for, you know, for the better for survivors of sexual abuse and assault, particularly for Pacific.